Hello again, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for joining to the fifth session of the 5G Into the Abyss reading series, in which I open my window and read off the balcony into the Zoom cloud and then upload them to YouTube for those of you who want to listen and go through the words of writers that I find inspiring during times of crisis and times of confrontation with the abyss, which maybe for everyone at all times. And we continue in our third meeting now of reading Friedrich Nietzsche's Schopenhauer as Educator. This is his third untimely meditation in a series of 4 essays that he wrote in his 20s. And it's translated and with notes by Daniel Pellerin. So I continue where I left off, starting from section 3. The esteem in which I hold a philosopher is always in proportion to the example he is able to give. That he may, by his example, draw entire peoples along cannot be doubted. The history of India, which is very nearly the history of Indian philosophy, proves as much. But the example must be visible in a man's life, and not just in his books. His teaching must be done, in other words, in the manner of the ancient Greek philosophers, much more through facial expressions, posture, clothing, diet, and custom than through speaking, let alone writing. Alas, how far we are in Germany from such a courageous visibility of the philosophical life. How very slowly our bodies are freeing themselves when our minds seem to have been liberated long ago. Though it is mere delusion to imagine that the mind could ever be free and independent so long as the acquired freedom from constraint, which is really the creative freedom to constrain oneself, does not prove itself by every glance and every step from sunrise to sunset. Kant clung to the university, abased himself before the governments of the day, maintained religious appearances, and tolerated his colleagues and students. So it is only natural that his example has mostly produced university professors and university philosophy. Schopenhauer, by contrast, paid little heed to the learned caste. He distanced himself. He strove for independence from the state and society. That is, the example he gives, the ideal he represents, to start at the most superficial level. But there are many degrees in the liberation of philosophical life that remain unknown among the Germans. And things cannot remain thus forever. Our artists live more boldly and honestly, and the most potent example before us, that of Richard Wagner, shows how a genius must not be afraid to place himself in the most hostile opposition to existing forms and orders if he means to bring the higher order and truth that lives inside him to light among his contemporaries. That truth, of which there is so much talk among our professors, on the other hand, seems to be a rather undemanding thing that does not frighten anyone with any anything disorderly or extraordinary, an easygoing and homely creature, eager to reassure the powers that be again and again, that no one has any inconvenience to fear from what is, after all, only pure research. Philosophy in Germany will have to start unlearning how to be pure research. Schopenhauer shows the way. It is nothing short of a miracle that he could grow into such a human example, for there were tremendous dangers, external as well as internal, crowding in on him, each of which might have crushed or splintered a weaker creature. I would say that it looked very much as if the man Schopenhauer would perish and leave behind only a remnant, a little pure research at most, and likely not even that. An Englishman of more recent times discusses the most common danger that faces unusual human beings who must live within societies wedded to all things customary. Uncongenial minds become first cowed, then melancholy, then out of health, and at last die. A Shelley in New England could hardly have lived. A race of Shelleys would have been impossible. End quote. Our own Holderlin and Kleist were doomed by their unusualness and could not endure the climate of so-called German culture. Only such iron natures as Beethoven, Goethe, Schopenhauer, and Wagner are able to withstand it, and even their features and wrinkles bear witness to the fatigues of so much struggling and straining. Their breathing has lost its natural ease, and the tone of their voices gets too sharp all too easily. An experienced diplomat After barely glancing at Goethe and exchanging only a few words, turned to a friend and said, "Voilà, un homme qui a eu de grands chagrins." There's a man who has had great sorrows, which in Goethe's German reads, "Das ist auch einer, der sich auch sauer werden lassen." There is another for whom things have gone sour. He adds, "If the vestiges of our past sufferings and actions cannot be erased from our facial features, then it is no wonder if everything that remains of us and our purposes will bear the same marks." And that is Goethe talking, the man to whom our cultural Philistines like to point as the happiest German of all, thereby proving to their own satisfaction that it is quite possible to live happily among them, with a corollary that no one shall be forgiven for feeling unhappy and lonely in their midst. Thus the maxim postulated and demonstrated with great cruelty that there must be secret guilt wherever there is a case of loneliness. Poor Schopenhauer, too, bore such a secret guilt in his heart, namely that of preferring his philosophy to his contemporaries. And he was unfortunate enough to have learnt from none other than Goethe that if he wished to preserve his philosophy, he would have to defend it at any cost against the disregard of his times. For there is a kind of inquisitorial censorship in which the Germans, according to Goethe, have made great strides. Inviolable silence, among whose signal accomplishments must be counted the fact that most of the first edition of Schopenhauer's great work ended up being pulped. The looming danger that his great deed might simply be undone through neglect left him in a terrible state of agitation, and that was not easy to tame. Not a single significant follower showed himself. It is saddening to see him hunting for the merest scraps of publicity, and there is something painfully moving about his loud, nay noisy, triumph. Ligor et legar, I am read, I shall be read. When at last he found himself being noticed. It is precisely in those of his features that least suggests the dignity of the philosopher that we can see the suffering human being who fears for his most precious goods. Thus he was tormented by the worry that his small fortune might be lost and that he might have to give up his pure and genuinely ancient attitude toward philosophy. And thus his longing for truly ingenious and compassionate human beings often led him astray, whence he always returned with sorrow in his eyes to his faithful dog. He was a recluse through and through. Not a single truly like-minded friend consoled him, and there was an infinite distance between one and none, as always, between I-ness and nothingness. No one who has real friends can know what true loneliness is, even if the whole world turned against him. Alas, I can tell you that you have no idea what it means to become truly lonesome. Wherever there have been powerful societies, governments, religions, public opinions, in short, wherever there has been tyranny, there the lonely philosopher has been hated. For philosophy offers man a refuge inaccessible to all tyrants, the den of interior life, the labyrinth of the heart, and that angers tyrants. Lonely men may hide themselves there, but it is also where the greatest dangers lie in wait for them. These men who have escaped inward with their freedom must still lead an outward life as well, becoming visible and showing themselves. By birth, domicile, education, fatherland, chance, and by the importunities of others, they are enmeshed in countless human connections. Countless opinions are likewise attributed to them simply because they happen to be the dominant views. Every gesture that is not a denial will be taken for an affirmation. Every movement of the hand that does not smash things up will be understood as a sign of approval. They know well, these lonely and free spirits, that they will invariably appear in one thing or another to be other than what they actually are in their thoughts. Desiring nothing but trust and sincerity, they are caught in a web of misunderstandings. However great their desire to keep their actions from being shrouded in a haze of false opinions, accommodations, near concessions, kindly omissions, or erroneous interpretations, there is nothing they can do to prevent it. Thus, a cloud of melancholy gathers on their brows. For such natures hate it more than death itself, that we must necessarily seem, do what we may, which so embitters them that they become volcanic and menacing. From time to time, they take vengeance for the violent concealment and self-restraint that has been forced upon them. They emerge from their dens with terrifying grimaces. Their words and deeds are explosions then, and it is possible that they will perish of themselves. So dangerously did Schopenhauer live. It is such lonely ones, above all, who need love, who need companions, before whom they may be as open and plain as they are before themselves, and in whose presence the tensions of restrained silence and pretense are dissolved. Take away these companions, and there will be a growing danger. Heinrich von Kleist, for example, was doomed because he was unloved, and the most terrible means to use against unusual men is to drive them so deeply into themselves that every reemergence of theirs must turn into an eruption. Every now and then, a demigod arises who can endure life even under such terrible conditions, and who can even live triumphantly. To hear his lonely song, listen to Beethoven's music. So much for the first danger in whose shadow Schopenhauer grew up, that of becoming lonesome. The second was that he might despair of the truth, a danger that must beset any thinker who takes the Kantian philosophy as his starting point, provided that he is a vigorous and complete human being, full of suffering and longing, and not just a clattering calculator or thought machine. Alas, we all know only too well how much cause for shame there is in this latter precondition. For it seems to me that there are only a few cases in which Kant's thought has actually come alive and been transformed into blood and other vital juices. It is everywhere alleged, of course, that the deeds of this quiet scholar are supposed to have started a revolution in all domains of knowledge, but I do not believe it. For when I look at the men around me, I see no clear indication that anyone's self has been revolutionized, which would need to be the first step before entire regions could undergo a revolution. If Kant ever actually began to have a popular impact, it would become visible to us in the form of a nagging, corrosive skepticism and relativism, which would be replaced only among the most active and noble spirits who have never been able to endure doubt for long, by the kind of upheaval and despair of all truth that Kleist, for one, experienced as a consequence of his exposure to Kantian philosophy. Quote, "A little while ago," he once wrote in his moving manner, I became acquainted with the Kantian philosophy, and now I must share a thought about it without getting afraid that it will prove as profoundly painful and devastating to you as it was for me. It is this: we cannot resolve whether what we call truth really is truth, or whether it only seems such to us. If the latter, then the truth that we gather here will be nothing after death, and all striving for possessions that might follow us to the grave is in vain. If the sharp point of this thought does not pierce your heart, do not smile at one who has been wounded deep down in his most sacred inward parts. My highest goal has sunk, and I have no other. When will human beings be able to feel in such a natural Kleistian manner again? When will they relearn to measure the meaning of a philosophy by their most sacred inward parts? This we need to know before we can begin to gauge whether just what Schopenhauer, coming after Kant, can be for us, namely the guide who will lead us, after having been the first to lead himself there, from the caverns of skeptical discontent and the self-denial of criticism up towards the heights of tragic contemplation, the starry night sky endless above us. Therein lies the greatness of Schopenhauer, in that he confronted the picture of life as a whole in order to interpret it in its entirety. While our cleverest minds cannot be dissuaded from the folly of thinking that one can arrive at a better interpretation by a painstaking examination of the colors, the paint, and the canvas, perhaps concluding that the fabric is of a most intricate weave and the paint of a chemical composition that is beyond the reach of science. Schopenhauer, by contrast, knew that one must make the right guesses about the painter if one is to understand a painting. Meanwhile, The whole guild of scientists aims at understanding the canvas and the paint, but not the picture. Hence, it might even be said that only someone who keeps his eyes firmly fixed on the great painting of life and existence can make use of the individual sciences without harming himself, because without such a regulative image of the whole, the sciences become mere ropes that never lead to any end and that serve only to confuse the course of our life and make it a labyrinth. Herein, once again, lies Schopenhauer's greatness, in that he pursues the whole picture as Hamlet does the ghost, without letting himself be fobbed off, as scholars do, or getting distracted by any scholasticism of terminology, which is the fate of all untamed dialecticians. The study of all quarter philosophies is appealing only insofar as it allows us to see how they immediately pounce upon those sections in the edifice of a great system of thought where one may indulge oneself in scholarly pros and cons, where it is permissible to mull, to doubt, to argue, and where the demand of all great philosophy is evaded, which, in its entirety, always says only one thing, quote, "This is the picture of all life, and from it you must learn the meaning of your existence." And conversely, read only from your own life, and thereby understand the hieroglyphs of life in general, quote. And thus Schopenhauer's philosophy, too, should be understood by the individual for himself in order to gain insight into his own misery and needfulness, his own limitedness, and then to get acquainted with the antidotes and consolations, such as making a sacrifice of one's ego and submitting it to the noblest motivations, among which justice and mercy take pride of place. Schopenhauer teaches us to distinguish between the real and the merely apparent causes of human happiness. How neither riches nor honors nor scholarly learning can raise one above desponding over the worthlessness of one's existence, and how the striving for such worldly goods can become meaningful only when it is illuminated by a higher, more complete purpose, namely that of attaining self-mastery in order to help one's physical being along and to correct its follies and blunders a little. All this only for oneself in the beginning, but eventually through oneself for everyone. Admittedly, such an ambition may lead to a deep and heartfelt resignation for what and how much can we really hope to improve at all, either individually or more generally. If we apply these words to Schopenhauer, we touch upon the third and most characteristic danger in which he lived and which lay hidden in his very build and bones. Every human being is wont to discover such limitations within himself, whether in what his meager talents leave him unable to do, or in what his moral shortcomings leave him unable to want, as must fill him with yearning and melancholy, and just as a sense of his own sinfulness will leave a man yearning for all that is holy, so he bears within himself, as an intellectual being, a deep craving for genius. Here lies the root of all true culture, in man's yearning to be reborn as a saint or genius, which one can easily understand in mythical terms without first becoming a Buddhist. Where we encounter ability without such yearning in scholarly circles or among so-called learned men, we are repelled and disgusted, because we can sense that such men, for all their brains, do not help culture to develop, but rather hinder it and prevent the arising of genius that is its very goal. What we have here is a case of petrification that is as unworthy as that merely habitual, frigid, and conceited virtuousness, which is the furthest from the true holiness and keeps it at bay. Now, Schopenhauer's nature was split in a most peculiar and dangerous way. Few thinkers have felt to such a degree and with such incomparable assurance as he that genius was alive within them. And his genius made him the highest promise, that there would be no deeper furrow than the one he was plowing into the soul of modern mankind. So one half of his being was thoroughly sated and fulfilled, equally free of desire and sure of its power, and he answered with greatness and dignity to the calling of one perfected in victory. Only in the other half there remained a tempestuous yearning, which we might discern when we hear that he averted his pained gaze from a picture of the great founder of the Trappist order, Jean de Rancé, with the words, "That is a matter of grace." For a genius yearns more deeply for holiness because from his perch he has seen further and more clearly than other men, down into the reconciliation of insight and being, across the kingdom of peace and of the negated will. and over the waters toward the other bank of the river of which the Indians speak. Here we have a miracle for how incredibly whole and unbreakable must Schopenhauer's nature have been if it could not be destroyed by such a yearning and did not become hardened either. What that means, we may all understand according to what and how much we amount to, though none of us will understand it completely in its full gravity. The more one ponders the three dangers I have outlined above, the more astonished one must be at how robustly Schopenhauer was able to defend himself against them and at how healthy and straight he remained when he emerged from the fight. With many scars and open wounds granted, and in a mood that was perhaps a little rough and at times rather too warlike. Above even the greatest human beings, there looms his own ideal. But that Schopenhauer can be a model for us. That much is certain. All scars and blemishes notwithstanding. One is even tempted to say that the flawed and all too human aspects of his being are just what will allow us to draw near to him in the most human sense. For thus, we are able to see him as someone who suffered, as a companion in our miseries, not just as someone set apart from us by the forbidding majesty of his genius. The three dangers that threatened Schopenhauer's constitution threaten us all. Each of us bears within himself, at the core of his being, some productive uniqueness that will give him a bright and unfamiliar aura, that of the unusual, as soon as he becomes aware of what is so unique about himself, which is something that the majority of men will find intolerable because they are lazy, as I have said, and because every uniqueness brings with it a chain of troubles and burdens. There is no doubt that the unusual man who takes that chain upon himself will thereby forsake most of what he expected of life in his youth: cheerfulness, security, ease, honor. He will become lonesome. That is how his fellow human beings will reward him. The desert and the cave will beckon no matter where he may choose to live. Now he must guard himself against the first danger, that of getting subdued, against becoming downcast and melancholy. Therefore, he may want to surround himself with images of those good and brave fighters of which Schopenhauer was one. Then there was a second danger, also by no means rare, that confronted Schopenhauer. Here and there we find a man whom nature has armed with a sharp mind that inclines him to the double dealing of dialectics. How easy it is for him, if he is incautious enough to give free rein to his abilities, to be destroyed as a human being and become a ghost whose life is confined to pure research. Or else he may, owing to his habit of seeking out every pro and con in things, be driven mad by his quest for truth and end up living without courage or confidence, negating, doubting, nagging, malcontented, half hoping, half expecting to be disappointed. Quote, "No dog could bear to live like this." The third danger is the ethical or intellectual petrification that results when a man tears asunder the bond that unites him with his ideal, when he ceases to be fruitful and to multiply in his domain, and when he thus becomes weak and useless for the purpose of culture. The uniqueness of his being has become an indivisible, incommunicable atom. Where once there was lava, now there is cold rock. And so a man may be ruined by his uniqueness as well as by his fear of the same, by holding onto himself as well as by giving himself up, by his own yearning as well by his own petrification. For to be alive is to be in danger. Besides the dangers inherent in Schopenhauer's whole constitution, to which he would have been exposed whatever century he had lived, there were also the dangers that arose for him out of his times. And it is important to bear in mind this distinction between constitutional and temporal dangers if we want to comprehend what is so exemplary and educational about Schopenhauer's nature. Let us imagine the eye of the philosopher resting upon existence. He means to reappraise its value and fix it at a new rate. For it has always been the peculiar task of great thinkers to be the legislators for measures and weights and the standards of coinage that apply to all things. What a hindrance it must be to him then, if mankind, as it is revealed to him in his immediate surroundings, should turn out to be a puny fruit riddled with wormholes. How much he must include if he wants to do justice to existence in general in tallying up the full sum of his own age's worthlessness. If it is worthwhile to study the history of past reform peoples, then it is so most of all for the philosopher who wishes to pass judgment on the lot of mankind as a whole, and who would be just not only towards the average, but more especially towards the highest lot that can befall either single men or entire peoples. Because the present will always force itself upon us, because it attracts and commands the eye, whether the philosopher likes it or not, it will invariably be estimated at too high a value in the final reckoning. That is why the philosopher must be especially careful when assessing his own age in contrast with others. It is only after he has been able to overcome the present within himself that he can also overcome the present in his picture of life, namely by making it unremarkable, and indeed by painting it over. It is a great, almost insurmountable challenge. The judgment of ancient Greek philosophers about the value of existence counts for so much more than any modern judgment because they had life itself before them and around them in such abundant perfection. And because with them, a thinker's feelings did not, as they do with us, get tied in knots over the tension between the wish for freedom, beauty, greatness of life on the one hand, and the urge towards truth, which asks only what existence is ultimately worth on the other. It remains important for all ages to know what Empedocles had to say about existence, amidst the most vigorous and exuberant joy of life, that of Greek culture. His judgment carries the greatest weight, especially considering that none of the other great philosophers of the same great age ever contradicted him. Empedocles speaks most clearly, but at bottom, if only one opens one's ears a little, they all say the same thing. A modern thinker, on the other hand, will always suffer from an unfulfillable wish. He will ask to be reminded of life, true, red, healthy life as it existed in the past before handing down his sentence. For his own part, at least, he will find it necessary to be a living human being before he can trust himself to be a just judge. That is why some of the most potent promoters of life, of the will to life today, are modern philosophers, and why they have such a yearning to be raised out of their exhausted age into a real culture that will once more exalt physical being. But this yearning is also their danger. In it, the reformer of life clashes with the philosopher, that is to say, with the judge of life. However the battle may turn out, the victory will be one that entails a loss as well. How was it that Schopenhauer escaped even that danger? So long as every great man would like to be seen as the truest child of his age, and so long as he will suffer more strongly and acutely from his afflictions than his inferiors, so long must the struggle of such a man appear as no more than a senseless and destructive fight against himself. But those are only appearances, because what he is fighting in his age is just what is keeping him from being great, which, in his case, means that he fights only to be free and to be entirely himself. Thus, his enmity is at bottom directed against that which may be inside him, but which is not essentially part of himself, against the pure confusion and the false association of elements that are incongruous and forever incompatible, against something time-bound, and that has been fraudulently soldered to him, and soldiered to that which is untimely about him. And so the supposed child of time turns out, in the end, to be merely its stepchild. Thus, Schopenhauer's striving from the earliest days of youth was directed against that false, vain, and unworthy mother, time, and by casting her out of himself, he cleansed and healed the core of his being, and thereby rediscovered himself in his own health and purity. The writings of Schopenhauer must be used as a mirror of time. Surely it is not the fault of the mirror if all that is time-bound is reflected in the form of a disfiguring malady, all pallor and emaciation, with hollow eyes and sunken features, the visible marks of a stepchild's sufferings. The yearning for vigorous nature, for wholesome and plain humanity, was in Schopenhauer a yearning for himself. And as soon as he had defeated time in himself, he was bound to discover, with an amazed glance, the genius dwelling there. The secret at the core of his being had been revealed. His stepmother, time, had been foiled in her efforts to hide his own genius from him. The kingdom of exalted physical life had been discovered. When he now turned his fearless gaze toward the question of what existence is ultimately worth, he no longer needed to concern himself with evaluating a confused and pallid time and judging its hypocritical and murky way of life. He knew full well that there are higher and purer things to be found and attained on this earth than such a time-bound life, and that it would be a bitter injustice to know and judge life only by such an ugly manifestation. No, let us now call upon the genius himself so that we might hear whether he is able to justify the highest fruits of life, and perhaps life in general. The glorious creative man shall answer this question, quote, Do you affirm this existence from the bottom of your heart? Does it suffice for you? Will you be its champion, its redeemer? Only say the word, and a single, truthful yes from your mouth shall free that life which stands so bravely accused. End quote. What will he answer? The answer of Empedocles. I'm going to leave it here. This is the end of section 3. We're going to go on to section 4 tomorrow. It's intense, and I appreciate all those who listen and tune in. I also just recommend reading it yourself and going over each thought, each paragraph, because it's so dense and so fantastic. All right. Talk to you all tomorrow. Bye now.